"This isn't for you," the CEO yelled at the homeless man, his finger pointed like a final verdict, the indifference of someone with the power to judge. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that the man, dirty and beaten down, held something in his hands that would make Ethan Cole's world crumble in seconds. Michael, standing in front of a luxury jewelry store window, carefully examines the watch on display. The gleam of gold and diamonds reflects the perfection of a world far removed from his. But he's there, staring intently at that one watch, as if it were the only one that mattered. Ethan Cole, the CEO, enters the showroom. His gaze is cold, calculating, and he quickly spots Michael. With an authoritative gesture and a voice dripping with disdain, he approaches and yells, "This isn't for you." The words come out like a sentence, as if he had the right to decide who deserves what. Michael, unfazed, simply smiles. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out a watch identical to the one in the window. It's not new. It's not shiny. It's worn, scratched, lived in. But Michael's smile isn't one of humiliation. He looks at the CEO and, with unnerving calm, says, "My father gave me one just like it before he worked here." When the watch turns, an engraving on the back is revealed, and that's when reality starts to shatter for Ethan. The past he tried so hard to bury is now right in front of him, and everything he thought he knew about himself and his story begins to fall apart. Before we dive back into this touching story, help us reach 1,000 subscribers, like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a moment. Now let's continue the story. It was a cold afternoon in New York. The streets were busy, but inside Ethan Cole's luxury jewelry store, the silence was absolute. The soft light from the lamps reflected off the windows, illuminating the jewelry pieces with a royal gleam. The store, with its minimalist and flawless design, exuded an air of exclusivity. Everything was perfect, as it always should be. Ethan Cole, CEO of Cole Luxury Watches, walked through the showroom with firm, quick steps, his designer suit perfectly tailored to his slender frame. His eyes, always calculating, scanned the space as if searching for any imperfection. He was the type of man who had everything under control, and nothing, not even the slightest mistake, went unnoticed. But that day, something was out of place. Michael, a man with a tired appearance and ragged clothes, stood in front of the window, staring at a specific watch. It wasn't just any watch. It was a rare piece, a model that only the wealthiest could afford. The gleam of the metal seemed to reflect the very luxury of a life he could never reach. Michael's gaze was fixed on the watch, but curiously, there was no desperation in his eyes. He was there, simply looking, as if contemplating a distant dream, but without the hope of ever touching it. Ethan noticed the man from a distance. His immediate instinct was one of displeasure, not because of Michael himself, but because the idea of someone like him being there, in front of his jewelry store, a place he had carefully designed to reflect his success, his status, and his vision, bothered him. Someone like Michael, with his dirty clothes and worn-out appearance, didn't belong in this world. Not there. Not in the space Ethan owned. With an impatient movement, Ethan approached, his voice cutting through the silence of the store like a blade. "This isn't for you," he said, louder than necessary. The words were soaked in contempt as if they were an irrefutable command. Michael, however, didn't move. His gaze, which seemed so distant from what was happening around him, didn't shift from the watch. The humiliation that would have been painful for many didn't seem to affect him. He was in a place that perhaps only he understood, in a space where time melted away, and the reality of Ethan's words held no power anymore. Ethan watched Michael more closely, as if expecting him to shrink or apologize. But none of that happened. Instead, Michael smiled. A subtle smile, but one filled with something Ethan couldn't immediately identify. With the same calm he had adopted since entering the store, Michael reached into his coat pocket. From there, he pulled out a watch. Not the one in the window, but something identical. The metal was worn, the surface scratched by time and life, and there was no shine. It was the opposite of the perfection Ethan was used to seeing. Michael held it in his hands, looking at it with a softness almost melancholic. Then, with a calm but firm voice, he said, "My father gave me one just like it before he worked here." The word father seemed to echo in the air, stronger than any other sound in the store. Ethan looked at the watch in Michael's hands, and his heart skipped a beat. It was identical, but what really made the difference was the inscription on the back. Ethan moved closer, almost unwillingly, as if drawn to the engraving, and read, "To my son, Jonathan Cole." It was as if the ground had opened beneath his feet. He knew exactly who Jonathan Cole was. He knew what that meant. Jonathan Cole wasn't just the founder of his company, but also the man he had always admired and spent so much time with during his youth. He also knew that Jonathan had lost a son, but that story had been buried a long time ago, swept under the family rug, hidden from public view. But there Michael was, with the watch in his hand, and Jonathan Cole's name engraved on it. The watch in Michael's hand seemed like a reflection of time itself, not just the time he had spent there in that moment gazing at the display window, but the time he had already lived. A time of losses, of suffering, of a life that, though marked by hardship, had not taken away his dignity. The shine of that watch wasn't in the gold or the diamonds, but in the story it carried with it. For a brief moment, Ethan didn't know what to do. He had been confronted with something he never imagined. There was a man in front of him, a man he considered an intruder, a misfit, someone who didn't deserve to be in the same space as him. But that man, that simple homeless man, had just deconstructed everything Ethan thought he knew about himself, his life, and his legacy. Michael, calmly, held the watch with his dirty hands. The contrast between that rare object, which gleamed in the windows of the luxury store, and Michael's figure was immense. Ethan looked at him, trying to decipher what was happening, trying to understand the logic of this moment that felt more like a surreal nightmare than the reality in which he had always felt comfortable. Michael's face was serene, almost as if he were waiting for a reaction. And indeed he was. But it wasn't just any reaction. It was something much deeper. He didn't want to humiliate Ethan. He didn't want revenge. What he wanted, or perhaps what he needed, was simply to be seen, finally, as if the simple act of existing in the same space was enough to tear down the wall of indifference that had been built between them. Ethan, feeling a knot tighten in his throat, reached for the engraving on the back of the watch. There was no denying it anymore. He recognized that inscription. "To my son, Jonathan Cole." The name Jonathan Cole echoed in his mind like an explosion. Jonathan Cole was the man who, in the eyes of everyone, was the foundation of his fortune, the cornerstone of the luxury empire he ruled with an iron fist. That name, which to so many meant only the founder of Cole Luxury Watches, for Ethan, carried an even deeper weight. Jonathan wasn't just the founder of the company. He was in many ways the only male role model Ethan had ever had in his life. A man of character, ambition, and success. But above all, a man who had lost something Ethan had never known. A son. That loss had been carefully hidden, almost erased from history. When Jonathan Cole died, no one spoke about the lost son anymore. No one spoke about Michael. Instead, only the convenient version was shared. Jonathan had no more family. He was alone, with no direct heirs. But now, standing before Ethan, was the man Jonathan had lost, the man he had left behind, the man the CEO had never known existed. "You can't be serious," Ethan murmured, his voice a thread of desperation. He looked at Michael, who seemed more like a shadow from his family's past than just a man. You can't be." Michael didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. The weight of what he was carrying, the simple act of holding that watch with his calloused hands, was more than words could express. He looked at Ethan with tired eyes, as if he didn't want to fight anymore. He had fought for so long, and now he had nothing left to prove. His past was engraved there, in that watch. The story was there in plain sight for everyone, but mostly for Ethan, who needed to understand that the man before him wasn't just a stranger. He was part of his own story, a part he had ignored. "I am Jonathan Cole's son," Michael finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, but laden with a sadness Ethan hadn't known existed in someone like Michael. "I'm the man you never knew existed, and now I'm here." Ethan, still in shock, looked at Michael with a mix of disbelief and fear. What he was hearing seemed impossible, as if he were in the middle of a nightmare he couldn't control. "But how do you—" Ethan couldn't formulate the words. He felt as though the truth was collapsing around him. Michael gave a small smile. "Don't worry. I didn't come here to cause trouble. I just came to see what your father built, to see what I lost, what was taken from me." Michael's words echoed in Ethan's mind, and he finally understood. Michael wasn't here to ask for anything. He didn't want money. He didn't want revenge. What he wanted was something Ethan had never considered, something he couldn't buy, something money couldn't return. "I wasn't raised to live with the luxury you have," Michael continued. "But my father gave me something you don't have, Ethan. He gave me a legacy, and that's what I carry with me. It's not gold, it's not diamonds, it's love, it's history." Ethan, still immersed in the whirlwind of his own emotions, looked at the watch once more. And for the first time in his life, he understood that the most valuable things can't be bought. They can't be forged in metal. They're made of moments of human connections and of a love that transcends time. The CEO, the man who had everything, now stood before something he had never known he possessed. A legacy of truth, of pain, and of reconciliation. Something he could lose forever. Ethan was frozen. He looked at Michael, trying to understand the gravity of the situation. Everything felt surreal, like an endless nightmare where he was the protagonist, but didn't know what to do with the script. Michael, with the watch in his hands, seemed calm, as if this moment had been awaited for years, a silent wait for an encounter he had known would be inevitable, but never knew when it would happen. For Ethan, however, that meeting felt as if it had been forged by a greater force, something beyond his control. "I didn't know," Ethan finally murmured, more to himself than to Michael. He tried to find the words, but they got lost in the confusion that overwhelmed his mind. "I didn't know my father had a son. I thought that he died alone." Michael watched him in silence. Ethan's words weren't an accusation, but a bitter realization, an attempt to understand a truth he never knew he would need to understand. Michael knew Ethan wasn't to blame. He wasn't responsible for a secret kept for so long, a secret buried in the shadows of the empire Ethan now led. But even so, there was a part of Michael that felt an inexplicable pain, as if the man before him had been part of what had led him to this life of abandonment and forgetfulness. "Your father, Jonathan," Michael began, his voice trembling but firm. He looked at the watch again, as if seeking some comfort there that could explain the unexplainable. "He didn't abandon me because he didn't love me. He abandoned me because at the time, the perfect family image he had built was more important than the son he had lost. The appearance of perfection has always been more important." Ethan heard those words and felt as if he were being pushed out of his reality. It was like the rug had been pulled out from under his feet, and now he was falling into an abyss of conflicting emotions, a mix of regret, confusion, and an ever-growing sense of shame. He looked at Michael, trying to understand what he wanted from all of this. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't a demand. Michael wasn't there to take what was his. He wasn't there to destroy everything Ethan had built. What Michael wanted, what he needed, was something Ethan couldn't give him. Michael wanted to be recognized, wanted to see that his story mattered. He wanted someone to finally look at him and understand that, despite everything, he had been someone who deserved to be loved, who deserved to belong. "I lived on the streets, Ethan," Michael continued, his voice now softer, more personal. "But on the streets I still had something you never had. I had an identity. I had the memory of my father, the memory of what he gave me. Even when I was lost, even when it all seemed to be stripped from me, I knew I wasn't alone, because my father gave me this watch." He lifted the watch, the worn gleam of the piece reflecting the soft light of the store. And this watch made me remember who I am. It made me remember what truly matters. Ethan was silent. Michael's words pierced his mind with a devastating clarity. He had never thought of his life this way. All he knew was power, control, the wealth he now possessed. He had never known what it really meant to belong to something bigger than himself. He had never known what it meant to have something that truly mattered beyond money and success. "I know you can't understand this, Ethan," Michael said, with a deep sigh. "You've spent your whole life chasing something that was never yours, something your father built. But that was never really yours. He built it for the world, but forgot to build a family. And I was forgotten, hidden, because the image of a successful man who lost his son, that didn't sell. That wasn't luxury. It wasn't what your father wanted to show the world. He preferred to lose me than to deal with that." Ethan couldn't avoid the pain rising in his chest. He felt a growing anguish, as if a wall were collapsing on him. He looked at Michael, now understanding that this man wasn't just a reflection of what his father had lost, but a reflection of what he, Ethan, was about to lose as well. The connection he had never had with his father was now standing before him, and he was unable to reach it. He looked at the watch once again, the aged metal seeming to dissolve before his eyes, as if he were watching time itself crumble. "I didn't know," Ethan said, his voice choked. "I didn't know you existed. I didn't know that you were my brother. I never knew." Michael smiled, but it was a sad smile, filled with a resignation Ethan didn't understand but was starting to feel in his own skin. "I'm not your brother, Ethan," he said, looking down at the watch once more. "I'm just a man trying to figure out who he is. And you're trying to understand what you lost. But I'm not here to make you feel guilty. I just want you to know that, in the end, what matters is what you build for real. It's not money. It's not possessions. It's not watches. It's history. It's legacy." Ethan felt a deep pain, a sense of emptiness he didn't know how to fill. He felt the loss of something that would never be restored. Michael was right. He knew that now. He had chased luxury and perfection, but he didn't know what it meant to build something that truly lasts, something that truly mattered. Ethan looked at Michael, finally starting to see not just the man in front of him, but the very reflection of what he had become. A man who, though surrounded by wealth and power, had lost something essential along the way: the ability to connect with others, to be truly human. The silence that followed felt overwhelming. Inside the store, with its glass walls and gleaming luxury shelves, the atmosphere was charged with a tension that nothing could dissipate. Ethan stood still, his mind racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. He looked at Michael, but he didn't just see the man before him. He saw a reflection of what he had always feared but never had the courage to face. Michael wasn't just Jonathan Cole's lost son. He was the version of Ethan that he could have been, if he had made the right choices, if he had taken a different path. The humiliation Ethan felt was overwhelming, but there was something stronger than that. Something rooted deep in his chest, a feeling of regret so profound that he could hardly breathe. He had always believed that success was the key to happiness. He had always believed that his fortune and his position as CEO were the measure of his worth. But in that moment, standing before Michael, he no longer felt like the man who controlled an empire. He felt empty. He felt that, throughout his life, he had traded what really mattered for something that could never fill the hole inside him. Michael, on the other hand, seemed to be the antithesis of everything Ethan represented. He had no wealth, no status, no comfort of a welcoming home, but in his gaze there was something Ethan no longer knew how to recognize in himself. Peace. Peace with who he was. Peace with the scars life had imposed on him. Michael, though carrying the pain of a difficult life, seemed to carry a lightness Ethan had never experienced. He had found the strength to remain whole, to remember his origins and his true value, even when the world around him abandoned him. The question Ethan didn't want to ask echoed in his mind. How had he gotten here? How had he lost himself to such an extent? "Ethan," Michael said, breaking the silence once more. His voice was soft, but filled with something Ethan still couldn't fully comprehend. "You don't have to blame yourself. I'm not here to make you feel bad. I'm here because I needed you to know the truth. That's all." Ethan looked at Michael, still not believing what he was hearing. He was trying to process what was happening, but his mind was divided between anger, regret, and a sense of helplessness he never imagined feeling. He, who had always had control over everything, was now at the mercy of a story he hadn't known how to live. "I've lived my life seeking approval, Michael," Ethan said, his voice breaking, as if for the first time he was allowing himself to be vulnerable. "I lived to please others, to be the man everyone expected me to be, the CEO, the successful one, the one who always had everything. But I never asked myself what really mattered. I never asked if I was making the right choices." Michael looked at him, his gaze penetrating, as if trying to read the words Ethan didn't speak but were written on his face, in his gestures, in his posture. Michael knew that the pain Ethan was feeling wasn't just about him. It was about everything he had lost in the process. The life he had chosen to live, the life of power and glory, was a facade, and Michael, who had lived on the streets with nothing but his own dignity, knew more about true life than Ethan had ever known. "And do you think it's too late to change?" Michael asked, his voice calm but filled with a wisdom Ethan didn't know how to respond to. The question hung in the air. Ethan looked at the ground, trying to process everything that was happening, but the truth was that he was lost. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to deal with this revelation, nor how to deal with the man before him who, in a way, was his mirror. The mirror of a life he had chosen to live without ever stopping to ask if it was really the life he wanted. Michael continued, his tone still gentle but direct. "I lived most of my life without a roof over my head, without a home, without the security you've always had. But one thing I learned on the streets, Ethan, is that none of this, all this luxury, means anything if you don't have what really matters. You can't buy happiness. You can't buy peace. And you certainly can't buy family. You can have everything money can buy, but in the end, if you don't have those things, what do you have?" Ethan couldn't hold back any longer. Tears began to form in his eyes. It wasn't shame. It was the release of something he had kept locked inside for too long, something he never knew how to express. The pain he felt was the pain of living a lie, of chasing something that couldn't fill the emptiness inside him. He felt an urgent need to change, but he knew that the lost time couldn't be regained. Michael, seeing Ethan's internal struggle, took a step back, his gaze softer now. "I'm not here to accuse you, Ethan. I'm not here to make you pay for the mistakes you've made. I'm just here to show you a truth you never wanted to see. And I just wanted you to know. I wanted you to know who you are, and that, in the end, that's what will define who you become." Ethan looked at the watch Michael still held, the worn piece that somehow carried all the truth of his life. He felt his father's presence there, as if, through Michael, he could finally understand the man he had never known to be. He was no longer the CEO. He was no longer the powerful man who controlled the empire. He was just a man, facing his past, trying to understand who he really was. "I don't know what to do with all this," Ethan finally said, his voice low. I don't know how to forgive myself." Michael looked at him with a gaze that wasn't of judgment but of understanding. "You don't need to forgive yourself, Ethan. You just need to start being who you really are. And who knows, from there maybe you'll find a path worth following." Ethan didn't know where to begin. The weight of the revelation, the truth finally in front of him, felt crushing. He looked at Michael, still there before him, with a look so calm and serene, as if he had already made peace with what had been taken from him. Michael wasn't there to demand anything, wasn't there to seek revenge or lament. He was there because he knew what needed to be done, to give Ethan the chance to finally see what he had lost, what he never knew he could have. I know you're lost right now, Ethan, Michael said calmly, as if he had seen this process before. You're wondering if it's worth changing, if it's worth seeking something beyond what you already have. I know you're trying to process all of this, but you already know the answer. Those words hit Ethan with the force of a punch to the stomach. He didn't want to hear that. He didn't want to know what Michael had to say. He wanted the pain, the shame, and the regret to disappear. He wished that moment had never happened. But deep down, he knew there was no turning back. The truth was there, right in front of him, and he could no longer ignore it. The watch in Michael's hands now seemed like a symbol of something much greater than any material possession Ethan owned. That simple piece, worn by time, represented more than Jonathan Cole's legacy. It represented the raw truth about what really matters in life, about what really endures when everything else falls apart. Michael, with his serene gaze, was there to show Ethan that what he had built wasn't enough. He hadn't built relationships. He hadn't built the human connection that truly makes a difference. Ethan, Michael said once more, his voice full of a softness that Ethan never expected to hear from someone who had spent so much time on the streets. You don't have to change the world all at once. You don't have to reverse all the mistakes at once. But you have to start. You have to start seeing what's most important. And maybe, just maybe, you'll start to realize that it's not money that defines who you are. Ethan looked at the floor. He felt the weight of what Michael was saying. The truth he had always tried to avoid was now screaming in his mind, and he no longer knew how to deny it. He didn't know how to live the lie he had been living anymore. But at the same time, he didn't know how to begin to change, how to start rebuilding what he had destroyed even if he hadn't realized it. He looked at the watch in Michael's hand once more, as if that simple object could be the key to everything, as if that was what he really needed to understand who he was and who he should be. Ethan began, his voice faltering, the words tumbling over one another. I've spent so much time trying to be who I thought people wanted me to be, trying to be what my father wanted me to be, trying to be this perfect man, this successful man, this powerful man. And now I see that everything I've done, everything I've built, was just a facade. I'm not any of that. I'm not that man. Michael didn't answer immediately. He just looked at Ethan with a gaze that wasn't judgmental but understanding. He knew Ethan was going through an internal process, a struggle that was unique to him. Michael knew that the pain of realizing his life had been shaped by a lie was something Ethan would have to face alone. But he also knew that this pain was the turning point. It was the moment when Ethan, finally, would have the chance to be true to himself. You don't have to be the man your father wanted you to be, Ethan, Michael said calmly. You don't have to be that CEO. You don't have to live that life you think you need to live. What you need to do now is discover who you are, without all the masks, without the money, without the facade. Just you. And you'll discover, Ethan, that you'll never be happy until you figure that out. Until you start living your life for real. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. Michael's words weren't just truths. They were a call, a summons to something more. Something he knew he needed to do but had never had the courage to face. He looked at Michael, his eyes filling with tears. But these weren't tears of shame or pain. They were tears of release. Because in that moment he knew the first step had been taken. He knew that although there was still a long way to go, that encounter, that revelation, that confrontation with Michael had been the key to his transformation. I don't know where to start, Ethan said, his voice now calmer, as if he were finally accepting the reality before him. But I know I need to start, and as afraid as I am, I will start. Michael smiled, a light smile, as if he were finally seeing the change happen before him. It wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of understanding. He knew Ethan wasn't ready to fix everything in that moment, but he knew that Ethan was ready to take the first step. That's all you need, Ethan, Michael said. The first step. The rest will come with time. But you have to be honest with yourself. Only then will you find peace. And peace, Ethan, is the only thing that truly matters. Ethan looked at the watch once more, the metal now gleaming with a different light. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that, from that moment on, he would begin to live his life in a way he had never imagined. He looked at Michael with a new understanding and finally said with sincerity, "Thank you, I don't know what I would do without you here." Michael simply nodded, saying nothing more. He knew that Ethan was now on the right path, and for him, that was enough. The store seemed to have shifted an atmosphere, as if a curtain had been lifted, revealing what had been hidden behind the glass walls and luxury. Ethan didn't know exactly what was happening inside him, but something in his heart stirred. What Michael had said still echoed in his mind, and he couldn't stop thinking about everything he had lived and what could still be done. The world he had hidden in, surrounded by wealth and power, no longer made sense. He didn't know how he had come so far without realizing what truly mattered. He knew now that he had lost something much more important, his own humanity. Ethan looked at Michael, who was standing there, waiting for an answer, but not an empty one. Michael didn't need words. He needed action. He needed to see that, in the end, their encounter meant more than just the revelation of a family secret. Michael, with all his suffering and abandonment, had already made his journey. Now it was Ethan's turn to make his. Michael took a step back, allowing Ethan to take the lead. He knew Ethan was still fighting an internal battle. Michael wouldn't pressure him. There was no need. Ethan knew now that the change he was seeking started within himself. There was no more delaying, no more ignoring what was right in front of him. Ethan began to walk through the store, his steps hesitant at first, but soon more firm, as if he were finally waking up to reality. He felt the need to fix things, to repair what had been broken. He looked at the products on the shelves, the luxurious displays, the gleaming watches. Everything seemed so empty now. They meant nothing. They were just objects. And for a moment, Ethan felt a growing anger toward himself for having placed so much value on things that, deep down, didn't matter. The watch in Michael's hands, still in his grasp, seemed to symbolize a life Ethan now wanted to understand. It wasn't the watch in the display, but his father's watch, with the engraving that connected him to something he had lost. Humanity. Love. The family bond he had never had. The watch was more than a gift from Jonathan Cole. It was the reminder that, in the end, what truly mattered wasn't things, but people. Michael, seeing that Ethan was beginning to take the lead, moved closer, but without haste. He knew that at that moment, Ethan needed to be alone, with his own thoughts. He needed to take the reins of his own life. Michael had done his part. Now, it was time for Ethan to do his. Ethan stopped in front of one of the displays, staring fixedly at the reflection of his own image. The man he saw there was no longer the unbeatable CEO. He was a broken man, but also one renewed, a man who was beginning to realize the weight of the choices he had made. He looked at himself, trying to understand what he was seeing, trying to find something of value in that reflection. And finally, he realized that what truly mattered was what he would do from that moment on. "I need to change," Ethan murmured to himself. "I need to do something real, something that's not just about me, something that means something." Michael heard him, and without saying a word, nodded slightly. He knew that Ethan was ready. He knew that Ethan had finally understood what mattered, and that for Michael was enough. He knew that Ethan's true transformation didn't depend on grand gestures or grandiose words. It would depend on small actions, on behaviors that truly showed he was willing to change. Ethan turned to Michael and looked at him with a look that said everything. "I want you to know that, despite everything, I care," he said, his voice now firmer. "I want to be part of your life if you'll let me. I want to be more than just a name from the past. I want to rebuild what's been broken." Michael looked at him with a deep and peaceful gaze, without rushing to respond. The answer was in his actions, and Ethan's actions were beginning to speak for themselves. "I don't know what the future holds for us, Ethan," Michael replied, "but what I do know is that what truly matters is what we do with what we have now, and now we have a chance." Those words stayed with Ethan as he and Michael left the store. They weren't just leaving a building of glass and gold. They were leaving a world that had been built on appearances, on what others saw and valued, to enter a world where what truly mattered wasn't what was visible, but what was in the heart. The true wealth was in the connections, in love, in family. And Ethan now understood that. As they walked down the street, Ethan felt a weight lifting off of him. He didn't know exactly what he would do next, but he knew that the first step toward true change had already been taken. He looked at Michael, and for the first time in a long time he smiled. It wasn't a smile of shame or regret, but a genuine smile from someone who knew that the journey to become the person he had always meant to be began at that moment. Ethan was finally starting to understand what it meant to be free. The sun was beginning to set as Ethan and Michael left the store. The lights of the city began to flicker on, reflecting on their faces and illuminating the path ahead. The luxury store, with its glass facade, now seemed distant, like a life Ethan had left behind, a life he now wanted to understand from a new perspective. He felt that everything that had happened that day had been the first step toward something greater, something he couldn't fully define yet. But what he knew for sure was that he couldn't go back to the life he had before. They walked through the bustling streets of New York, the noise of the city blending with the inner quiet Ethan felt. There was a strange yet powerful calm inside him, as if the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. It wasn't that he had solved all his problems. It was something deeper than that. For the first time in a long time, he was at peace with himself. Michael, by his side, didn't speak much, but Ethan knew the words had already been said. What remained now were actions, and he knew the actions he would take from that point on would define who he would become, not as the CEO of a great company, not as the son of Jonathan Cole, but as a man who finally understood that the true value of his life wasn't in the success he had built, but in the people he loved and who loved him. "You know, Ethan," Michael said, breaking the silence, "I spent a long time wanting to understand what was wrong with me, wanting to understand why life had put me where I was. But the truth is, even in the worst situations, I never stopped believing there was something good waiting for me, something bigger than myself." Ethan looked at Michael, the expression on his face softer now. He realized that, though they had grown up in different worlds, they had both come to the same conclusion, through tortuous paths but equally valid. Michael, with his life of hardships, knew more about hope and faith than Ethan had ever known, and that somehow gave him a sense of admiration. "I don't know if I'm capable of doing this," Ethan replied, his voice low. "I don't know if I can change everything I've done up until now. But what I know is that now I see. I see that the things I've chased in life, the things I thought were important, are nothing compared to having someone to share this journey with. I realize that the success I thought was worth pursuing has no value without the people by your side." Michael looked at him, and the smile on his face was genuine, with no trace of bitterness. "I knew you'd get there. You just needed to see with your own eyes." Ethan fell silent for a moment. He didn't know what the future held, but something inside him had changed. He couldn't go back. What he had now was a chance to start over. He didn't know if he would be successful. He didn't know if he could fix the damage of the past, but he knew that, if he didn't try, the pain of not trying would be far greater than any failure that could come. They walked for a few more minutes until they stopped at a small cafe, where Ethan decided it was time to do something that, until that moment, had seemed impossible. He asked Michael to sit, and for a moment they both remained silent, as if they knew the words that were about to be spoken didn't need any fanfare. They were simple words, but with deep weight. "I'd like to start from scratch," Ethan finally said, looking at Michael with a sincerity he had never known before. "I don't want to live for expectations that aren't mine anymore. I want to look at you as the brother you've always been, and not as someone who was forgotten. I want to do something real, something that honors our father, something that honors the legacy that, now I understand, is much more than gold and success." Michael, with a simple smile and an expression of understanding, nodded. There was no need for more words. The change Ethan was seeking wasn't in the words he said, but in the actions he would take next. The real transformation was already underway. In the days that followed, Ethan did what seemed unthinkable. He began to undo the life he had so carefully constructed. Not in a drastic way, but with small gestures. He started paying more attention to the people around him. He began to listen, really listen instead of dictating. He started dedicating his time to building something far more valuable than the numbers on a spreadsheet or the appreciation of his brand. He began to rebuild his relationship with his father's legacy, but also to create a new legacy for himself. In one of the first meetings he had with the team, Ethan surprised everyone by sharing his new intentions. "I'm not the man you think I am anymore. I'm no longer the one who only thinks about success at any cost. I'm here to build something more, something that truly matters, something that respects the people who make this company what it is. And I won't do it alone. I need all of you." The reactions were varied. Some were skeptical, others surprised, but everyone could tell there was something different in Ethan's tone. He was no longer trying to be the distant leader. He was trying to be human, trying to be someone who understood the value of connections, empathy, and respect. Michael, on the other hand, began to reconnect with his own family, rebuilding bonds that had been broken in the past. He wasn't seeking a grand reintegration, but simply reconnecting with what truly mattered. He found his own peace, not in an empire of wealth, but in small moments of reconciliation and in giving himself permission to be vulnerable. Ethan and Michael's story spread, but not as a story of wealth or power. They were no longer known as the owners of a great brand, but as those who had found what truly matters. They were known for their humanity, for their ability to rebuild not just a company, but a legacy of truth, love, and genuine connections. And in the end, when all was said and done, what remained was what Jonathan Cole's watch had represented from the beginning. The true value wasn't in gold, nor in success, nor in what they had lost, but in what they were about to build, together. A legacy that would be passed on not by material goods, but by the way we treat others, by how we live with purpose, and by the ability to finally be who we are. Thank you so much for watching this story until the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next ones. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think about the choices made by the characters? Do you agree with how things unfolded, or would you have done something different? Drop your opinion in the comments below.